Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Busboys and Poets Books Presents, a book series we do here where we invite authors, their contemporaries, their peers, and colleagues, and we talk about their books. I'm so excited to introduce you all to today's speakers. But first, my name is Lori. I'm Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books, which is based out of here in DC. My pronouns are they, them. And tonight we have Busboys and Poets Books presents Until I Am Free with Dr. Keisha Blain. Now, today's book is really exciting because Fannie Lou Hamer is somebody that we just don't hear much about, we don't talk about, but she is just as important as really great figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, etc. And I'm so happy to hear from the two guests we have tonight. So first we have Dr. Keisha Blain, who goes by she, her. She is a professor, historian, and obviously writer. She was the co-editor of 400 Souls and now the writer of Until I Am Free, which is all about Fannie Lou Hamer and the enduring message of hers to the United States of America. And in conversation with her, we have got Dr. Clint Smith, who is a writer and author who has written both Counting Dissent and writes also for The New Yorker. And without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and bring our guests on screen. Hi, folks.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really excited that we get to talk about the book.
Yeah, it is a real pleasure. And for folks who don't know, I was lucky enough to be a contributor to the incredible book that Keisha and Ibram put together in 400 Souls, which is here somewhere. And Keisha and I also worked together in sort of putting together the synopsis and the outline of the Crash Course Black American History course, which I am lucky enough to be the host of. And when I was thinking of historians that I wanted to partner with and thinking of people who embody the spirit of public history and who are both incredible historians and but specifically incredible historians who are so effective at translating history to a wider and more popular audience. And if you've read Keisha's MSNBC columns, you know how excellent she is at that. So it was almost 2 years ago, maybe, that we started putting this course together. And we're about halfway through now, and it couldn't have happened without Dr. Blaine. So it is lovely to be here with you outside the context of a work Zoom. So
right.
If you all have not picked up this book, the thing about virtual events is we're like almost 2 years into this thing. But the thing about virtual events, you can come to a virtual event, you could be like, oh, like, yeah, I want to see it. You have it on in the background. You're like putting your kids down. You're making dinner. You're washing the dishes, doing all sorts of things. And that's the great part of it. The thing about it is that sometimes you can forget to click the purchase button, right? And so what I need you to do now, before we even get started, is go and click purchase to go to Bookshop, do it on the Eventbrite, do it Libro FM. If you're not hip to Libro FM, it's an excellent audiobook. I read the book many months ago and was fortunate. I blurbed it and then I listened to it again last week. And it's like a quick and easy thing. You can read it in a weekend. You can listen to it in just like a few dishwashing, laundry doing sessions. And it's really excellent, really thorough, really beautiful. So please, before we even get started, buy it now. Get those orders up because we got kids to feed out here. You know, we're writers. We also got young kids. And I wanted to start by asking you specifically about the decision. You could have, theoretically, I guess, written a straightforward biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, but instead you decided to write a sort of intellectual history and also a biography. And really, what was interesting about it is you're putting Fannie Lou Hamer's ideas and her politics and her sensibilities and her evolution in conversation with things happening today and in conversation with many people today. When this thing was ideating, however long ago, did you initially think you were going to do a biography, or did you always have in mind that you wanted to put her ideas in conversation with the ideas of the moment? What's the sort of origin story of the book in that sense?
Yes, such a great question. I think, you mentioned earlier that I write for MSNBC. And as soon as you said that, I remembered the first time that I wrote about Hamer was in the form of an op-ed. And this was in 2016. Of course, as I explained in the book, I've been thinking about Hamer for much longer. I first learned about her in 2008 while I was actually a senior in college. And but in 2016, I had the opportunity to write a short op-ed. It was around the anniversary of the 1964 speech that Hamer gave at the Democratic National Convention. And so I wrote a piece particularly about her speech and its connections to present day at the time. And I think that was the first moment where I started to think carefully about how we might return to Hamer's ideas as we strategize how to address a number of issues. And of course, in 2016, at the time, so many people were talking about still, of course, voter suppression and all of the attacks on the Voting Rights Act. As you know, the Shelby case was 2013. So only 3 years out, I was writing about Hamer and the importance of her voice in this larger struggle for Black political rights. But it was not until, I think, several years later that, again, I was writing another op-ed about Hamer, making a case that Hamer's ideas, particularly about how we might strategize to figure out, I think, how to make this place, how to make this nation better. I wrote a piece for Time magazine in 2019, making a case that Hamer had the answers when we were trying to, again, talk about how to deal with state-sanctioned violence, how to address voter suppression. And I think the response to both pieces underscored the importance of writing this book. So many people reached out to me, including Hamer's family, which I think was probably that moment where I thought, oh, wow, this is so important. So many people said to me, we appreciate this piece. We appreciate the work that you're doing. And more so, you have a story to tell, and so many people said you should expand this into a book. I eventually came to the decision that in fact, I needed to write the book. And thankfully, an editor at Beacon Press agreed that this would be a very good idea. And I started writing that book. I go back to those op-eds because essentially, since I was already thinking about drawing the connections between past and present, it just made sense to write a book that would do a similar thing, that would get people to understand Hamer's life, her legacy, but more so to get them to see how the struggle is ongoing and get them to start thinking about how we might apply Hamer's ideas and even learn from her activism to strategize and figure out a way forward. So I certainly hope that the structure of the book gives people those kinds of tools.
For folks who might be coming to this event who don't have a lot of context about Hamer or her biography, the interesting thing is that she came to activism pretty late in her life, right? I think she was 44, you're right.
Right.
When she got involved and died when she was 59. And so what is it that propelled her? If you could talk a little bit about that at such a later stage than most people, so many of the activists we think of this period are incredibly young. They're college students. They're, Dr. King was in his 20s when the Montgomery bus boycott began. Hamer's story is very different. Yeah. What brought her into the movement at that point in her life?
So many factors. One of the things that I think we have to talk about is the crucial role of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. And this is, I think, perhaps one of the most significant civil rights organizations of the period. This is an organization that was interracial. It was one that was grassroots and also student-led. And so in SNCC, you'd find folks like John Lewis involved. You'd find Stokely Carmichael, who would go on to play a pivotal role in the Black Power movement. And it's so important, I think, to talk about how this organization helped to mentor leaders at the grassroots level. One of the things that Hamer said several times, and I talk about it in the book, and I do push back a bit, but I think it's important in this context. She would say that SNCC activists were very different from the NAACP. She would criticize the NAACP as not necessarily focusing on the development of grassroots leaders. As I point out in the book, that critique is not in, I don't think it speaks accurately to the full picture of the NAACP, because we know historically that the organization did in fact play a key role even in the Mississippi Delta and in mobilizing local activists. But I think the point for Hamer was that she felt that oftentimes the leaders of the NAACP or other groups would come into communities and show up as if they had all the answers, and they would be the ones telling local people what to do. And in her mind, SNCC had a very different model. They certainly came into the community with ideas, they came with resources, and they wanted to equip people. And for them, it was about, how do you tap into the leadership potential of people within communities? And Fannie Lou Hamer credits SNCC for ultimately seeing something in her, for seeing her potential, for listening to her. She said that when she encountered SNCC activists, it was the first time anyone had taken her seriously. And that stayed with me. I thought that was such a powerful reflection because it speaks to that broader vision of the movement of nurturing leaders from the ground up. And so SNCC activists organized a mass meeting in August 1962. And Hamer initially was not going to go, but a friend encouraged her to go. It was already taking place at a local church. And she was a woman of faith, always went to church services. And she went, and as she explains it, it was both a political awakening and also a spiritual awakening, because in that meeting, she not only learned about her constitutional right to vote as a citizen of the United States, but she said that in that meeting, she found her calling. And she saw that it was actually divinely ordained, that it was God's will for her to join the movement and to play a critical role in expanding Black political rights. She saw herself as being a light in a world of darkness. And so I think all of these factors came together for her. And quite frankly, she walked out of that meeting completely different. She never looked back. And she devoted, the next 15 years, she devoted fully to supporting the movement and making a difference.
One of the things, and you just alluded to this, is that this book is at once a celebration of Hamer, but you're also clear about moments in which your sense of history, your analysis is different. And the thing is, she is at once ahead of her time on so many fronts. And you specifically, you talk a lot about Hamer's politics and how they reflected this intersectionality before we necessarily had the word. On other ends, you also are honest, right, about the way that she was pro-life and that she was anti-abortion, and the sort of nuanced, complicated rationale that she had as to why that was. And so I think, and I say that because I think it would be easy for a writer to take Hamer and make her this sort of avatar of progressivism in all of its contemporary forms. But the reality of people is that they are more complex and nuanced, and the stories are not as clean as sometimes we can impose on them retroactively. How did you sort of think about that and navigate that process of wanting to both lift up and celebrate this person who is so important and often overlooked, but also not wanting to paint a two-dimensional picture of them, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And this is difficult. I have to say that writing my first book on Black nationalist women in so many ways prepared me for this complexity. When I wrote Set the World on Fire, I I was so frustrated at times because I was talking about a group of women who, at least in the modern conception of Black nationalism, were people who were advocating, Black political self-determination and self-sufficiency and African pride and all of these things, which are so valuable. Yet at the same time, I would see them reaching out to white supremacists, trying to collaborate with white supremacists around the notion of racial separatism, seeing white supremacists as potential allies in order to get to the ultimate goal, which is to establish a Black nation state, to ultimately lead the United States. I saw those complexities. I saw them collaborating with Japanese activists. I saw them thinking through how Japan might be an ally in the struggle for freedom at the same time that they're watching, the rise of Japanese imperialism. They're watching Japan invade Manchuria. I mean, they're seeing all of these moments that actually contradict this larger vision of liberation, and they're somehow pushing through and still trying to create for themselves some kind of world that will be better for their children, for their children's children. And I think there was a moment in writing that first book where I had to stop myself and say, my job is not to necessarily agree with all of their decisions. It's not even to fully, I think, understand, because I think that there is always a moment in which we go as far as we can as writers, as historians. But I came to the realization that all I needed to do was to try as much as possible to pull the sources together, to lay out for the reader the complexity, but more so to help readers understand why these individuals did what they did. And that meant understanding them in their context, certainly, their ideas about race, understanding what they saw as the possibilities before them or the limitations, how they imagined that white supremacists could be an avenue because they didn't see other potential avenues, right? And I think in a similar way, when it came to Hamer, I wrestled with writing that chapter about her ideas on women's rights. I think, like a lot of people, I came into it making assumptions that she would, in fact, it wasn't even clear to me initially that she was not a feminist, or rather that she did not embrace the label feminist. I just assumed, as I think many people do, that she was a feminist. The irony, as I explained in the book, is that though she rejected the term, we can see how her actions and even her words end up shaping the movement in interesting ways, as you alluded to with intersectionality. So I think overall it was a struggle, but I just reminded myself, you don't necessarily have to sort of, as a writer, place yourself at the center. I think I wanted to step back and say, okay, let me present to the reader everything that I've found, so that it can be as accurate as possible. I can tell what I know and get to the heart of why Hamer had these views, and only hope that in reading all of the details, people would understand her. They may not agree with her, but hopefully they would understand where she was coming from, and the world that she saw before her at the time. So that's what I tried to do. It definitely was a struggle at many junctures in writing the narrative. I had to just remind myself, okay, just tell it like it is. I mean, to go back to Hamer's own words, just tell the truth as you know it, and quote her too, so that people hear in her words why she resisted birth control, why she resisted abortion. Just use her own words and let people hear for themselves where she was coming from.
And it's interesting because I think it was incredibly effective, both for Hamer, but also because I think it's important for any political or ideological idea or thing that can serve as a sort of fissure in our larger body politic, for people to like dig into. I know we keep using this word, but like the nuance and complexity behind it. Because at face value, you're like, oh, Fannie Lou Hamer was like pro-life and anti-abortion, like that does. I think people can make a set of assumptions about why that is, but part of what you do so well is really grounded in the sort of larger context of the history of forced sterilization that so many Black women were experiencing. And that was a part of this history that I was unfamiliar with. I mean, I think I knew about it vaguely and on a sort of surface level, but Hamer was like intimately impacted by this. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect, and why you felt like it was important to include a pretty extended discussion on forced sterilization in Black women in this book?
Yes, absolutely. In 1961, 1 year before Hamer joined the movement, she was the victim of forced sterilization, as you point out. And just to provide a bit of context, Hamer had been hospitalized because she had a small uterine tumor, and this was a non-cancerous tumor. The white doctor who performed the procedure, unbeknownst to Hamer, removed her uterus. And as I explained in the book, as traumatic as that experience was, what is appalling too is to find out how Hamer learned about it. Hamer did not know what had happened initially. The doctor did not tell her. She found out through the Whisper Network because the doctor was related to someone on the plantation, and people were talking about what had happened to Hamer. When she finally found out, she confronted the doctor, was unable to get any answers from him, and he certainly, as Hamer pointed out, he didn't have to provide an explanation because this was a practice that was quite common. And Hamer, I think, just decided in that moment that she would ultimately bear witness. I mean, she decided as part of her strategy when she joined the movement that she would not only talk about Black political rights, certainly she would do that, but she decided that she would talk about what Black women were going through. She would talk about the experience of the forced sterilization to shed the light on this common practice, common in Mississippi, but also common, in other parts of the South and even across the nation at the time. And I think, I talk in the book about this notion of public testimony. For Hamer, it was always important to tell people the truth of what was happening because she saw that as transformative, and she saw it as a way to move people, to compel them to act. And so in the case of the forced sterilization, she set out to tell the story of what had happened to her over and over again to anyone who would listen. Well, what is so powerful, I think, as we're talking about her larger views on, one might say, feminist politics broadly, she was deeply hurt and deeply traumatized by that experience. As I explained in the book, before this took place, she had been trying to have children. She had been trying and trying unsuccessfully. And it just, I think, tore her apart to have this experience and know that someone had snatched from her the opportunity, to bear children. And she went on and adopted several children in her lifetime. But I think that particular experience changed her in a way that when she then heard people talking about birth control and talking about abortion, it actually angered her. There was a moment when she was at a conference, right? And she heard people, other women talking about the importance of reproductive rights and being able to control their bodies. And she just walked in and shut down the place. And ultimately what she did was she started talking about the forced sterilization. And I mean, everyone, I think, stopped speaking because what do you say? What do you say to someone who has gone through that much pain and violence? All you can do is listen. But for her, it always took her back there. She just could not endorse anything that in her mind she saw as standing in the way of the ability to reproduce, to have children. So it was personal for her along those lines.
And I think that it's so important to provide that context and that depth because otherwise people can, I think, develop a sort of misunderstanding or again make a set of assumptions about why this person is doing. But on just a human level, right? To like have surgery conducted on you and to not know that your uterus was taken. I mean, it's just when you think of, it's one thing. I mean, it's horrific to even imagine this happening to you and then being told after you wake up. But it's even more egregious right? This idea that it would happen to you, and you find out from other people through a whisper network. I mean, both the sense of violation, the sense of shame, embarrassment. I mean, it must have just been devastating on so many different levels. So it is not, I think what it does is stretch my muscles of empathy to say, well, like, it is not unreasonable given the experience of this person and given the larger structural context of what was happening to so many people and how that was a microcosm of what was happening to so many women, that they would, and in the context of their own faith, right, being such an important foundation of their life, that this would be the sort of conclusion they come to. And I think that was done really effectively. Another thing that happens in this book is you kind of have these cameos, if you will, of other Black women who show up in the book. It's Shirley Chisholm or Ella Baker or Eleanor Holmes Norton. And did that just sort of organically happen in the writing process, or did you, it's almost like when it's in some ways it felt like when you're watching like your favorite Black sitcom, and then like a character from another Black sitcom comes and you're like, I didn't even know they were appearing in this episode, and everybody on the laugh track like starts clapping. It's like when I think about those moments on like so many of those Black sitcoms from like the 90s and 2000s, and this was a version of that, because it's like I didn't know Eleanor Holmes Norton was showing up, and here she is. Yeah, did that just sort of happen organically, or did you always have in mind that was gonna that you wanted to put her in conversation with a lot of other actors at the time?
Well, I definitely knew that it would be important to weave in, I think, these narratives, because part of what I wanted to do was give people a sense of Hamer's family, certainly, but Hamer's broader community. So who are the people who supported her? Who are the people that she turned to for advice? Who are the people who collaborated with her? For example, I think I remember very early in the writing process, I could have just mentioned Ella Baker briefly as the visionary of SNCC and move on. But I thought, as I was going through the archives, Hamer would talk about Ella Baker often. In fact, she did an interview once where someone asked her who was the most influential, Black woman in her life, and she immediately said Ella Baker, and she spoke about how much she loved Ella Baker and how much she learned from Ella Baker. And so I thought it was important to center Ella Baker as much as I could, so that people could understand how, in that case, Ella Baker ended up being such an important mentor for Fannie Lou Hamer, someone who she turned to at various junctures. I talk about in the 1964 DNC. It's Ella Baker who Fannie Lou Hamer turns to, and also John Lewis is there. Bob Moses, actually. And she turns to the two of them to ask for advice. And you see these moments, which I absolutely love, because part of what I wanted to do was to help people, in a way, see themselves in this narrative, to imagine just, here you have this courageous Black woman. We can talk about her as fearless and all of that, but the reality is that there are moments of despair. There are moments of doubt. There are moments where she questioned herself, where she questioned, her own confidence. And she would turn to someone like Ella Baker. She would turn to other Black women often to lean on them. And I think that's just a beautiful, part of the narrative, and one that I think is important for us, in the contemporary context. There's often an emphasis on the individual, but I think it goes without saying that, behind every, successful individual, you will find a community, right, of people who are supporting, who are guiding, mentoring, and so on. And I wanted all of that to come through the text. So yes, it was absolutely intentional. The other quick thing I'll say too is it was partly a strategy as I was thinking through this idea of intellectual history. Oftentimes when you're writing intellectual history, if you're focused on like middle class and elite individuals, you often, you can find a trove of information whereby you can say, oh, here are the thinkers that they were reading, here are the books they were reading, here are the people, they were engaged in. If you're writing about Du Bois, you can mention all of these interesting folks he was reading and engaging. And part of what I wanted to do in sort of, emphasizing the community was to show the way that we sort of see intellectual history unfold, not simply through the written text, right? And so there's sort of this transfer of knowledge that's taking place, between Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, between, Shirley Chisholm and Fannie Lou Hamer. And you see how Fannie Lou Hamer, with a sixth grade education, might not, have been able to say that she's read certain thinkers or so on, but that she has been in dialogue with these individuals, and in so doing, there's a transfer of knowledge that I just find remarkable, that helps us see the crafting of an intellectual, and that's what I wanted people to see. I wanted them to see Fannie Lou Hamer as an activist, certainly, but also as an intellectual, and working poor, intellectual, disabled Black woman. So these are all things I was, thinking through, and I'm really glad that they were able to shine through the text that way.
And on that note, one of the things, there's so many. The thing about Fannie Lou Hamer is that there's so many just like good lines that she had, like all of the speeches that she made. She was like, she hit them with those one-liners. And you're speaking about sort of class dynamics. One thing she said was, whether you have a PhD or no D, we're in this bag together. Whether you went to Morehouse or no house, we're in this bag together. And so she had a lot to say about the class dynamics of the civil rights movement. And you alluded to it a little bit with regard to the NAACP and her sense of, like, especially on a national level, because people should be clear that there was this sort of national NAACP, but also a lot of local chapters and organizations. And I think part of what you write about in the book is the way that so much important grassroots work was done in the local chapters of the NAACP that isn't necessarily reflective of that there was, and that people often felt differently about the sort of local chapters and the work that they were doing versus what the sort of larger national infrastructure and the people who were the sort of heads of the organization were doing. But I am really interested in digging a little bit deeper into her class analysis, right? Because it was like a really ever-present and central part of her sort of larger intellectual praxis and her praxis of liberation, right? Making sure that when we're thinking about Black liberation, we are thinking of the Black poor, Black working class, and also like who is at the table and who is in conversation with the Democratic Party. Who is? There's this scene where it's interesting, again, like complicating characters. There's this scene you talk about, I think it's at the 64 DNC, that all the Black leaders had this meeting in a room and they didn't invite her. And then she finds out and she's like, oh, nah. And then she like goes to the room and this is like Martin. This is, this is the people that we're like, these are our folks. And you're like, dang, like Martin Luther King tried to purposely like keep this woman out of the room. But that is part of what she was, and she was sort of deeply cognizant of that, both as a woman, as a person of the working class. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. Wow. So many things come to the surface when you look at particularly the 1964 Democratic National Convention. As you point out, Fannie Lou Hamer finds herself in an odd position because she certainly expected resistance from white people. It's no surprise she was already dealing with this. She knew that she was showing up on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They were already, ruffling feathers because they were there to call out the racism, of the statewide party that had excluded Black participation. But I think she was a bit surprised, certainly disheartened by a lot of the resistance that she encountered from other civil rights leaders. But the resistance that she encountered, yes, there were absolutely some differences in terms of tactics and approaches. I think I want to acknowledge that, when Hamer was presented with a compromise of 2 seats, 2 symbolic seats, she didn't want to take the compromise because she resisted this notion of of symbolism, and she wanted, real representation. Other civil rights activists believed that in accepting the compromise, she would at least show a sign of good faith. It would actually help in the long term. They were thinking about the long game, the kinds of things they could do down the road, particularly
folks like
exactly, exactly. So I definitely want to acknowledge, that it was on the one hand a question of political, maneuvers and strategy. But what's interesting is the way people critiqued her, the way they spoke to her revealed absolutely the sexism and the patriarchy, um, and also the sort of the classism too. I think about Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, who called her an ignorant woman, right? And we know the implications there of calling her ignorant, not only along the lines of gender, but again, class, right? She was a working poor Black woman. She was a sharecropper. She did not have a ton of experience in these spaces. And then also an exchange that she has with Adam Clayton Powell that I talk about, which is so intriguing, where, this is prominent Black politician who says to Hamer, don't you know who I am? Because he's talking to her, he's giving her advice, and she's not accepting it. And her answer to him is, how many bales of cotton have you picked? How many beatings have you taken? And it's a moment where, again, she's reminding him, listen, I'm very much aware of who you are, but do not imagine that your title, that your, a position somehow takes away from me the right to speak on behalf of my community and to be a leader in this space, because I may not have the same, formal education, and I may not have the title and all of that. But what I do have is a lived experience of someone who has really been going through hell in Mississippi. And I'm here not only on behalf of myself, but on behalf of a community, asking and demanding for change, change in this instance. And so I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to the class dynamics, she's always emphasizing, and here I go back to intersectionality, she's always emphasizing the need to think about the multiple ways that Black women are oppressed in American society. She does this too, in the women's liberation movement, when she's speaking before members of, the National Women's Political Caucus. She stands up in front of them, and the first thing she's talking about is, let me tell you about my experience, doing domestic work in the homes of white women. Let me talk to you about how these white women treated me, because let's be real, we can't just stand here and talk about sisterhood and pretend that there isn't racism in the space, right? That there isn't white supremacy also shaping, our interactions. And so she called it out. And that, I think, is so powerful. When you think of Hamer as a voice, and I talk about her as really as a foremother of intersectionality, right? I mean, just decades before, Kimberly Crenshaw coins the term, you can see in Hamer's words and her activism, all of these pieces coming together.
Pivoting a little bit to sort of your work more generally, you were just the editor of this remarkably successful book, 400 Souls, that came out, really in the midst of the sort of, when we were at the center of, it felt like the sort of shift in public consciousness that we were experiencing as a country. Obviously not with everyone. And this is in many ways sort of before the backlash that we're seeing now in response to that shift in public consciousness around the history of race and racism in this country. Intellectually, like as a scholar, as a writer, as a thinker, as a person, what is I've not edited a major anthology, and I'm wondering, do you prefer? Maybe prefer is not the right way, but what is the sort of difference intellectually in terms of the process, the creative and intellectual process of editing the voices of others and putting it together cohesively and trying to, as you also beautifully put this sort of chorus of voices together to tell a sort of larger story versus writing a book yourself? Like, is there one that you're like, I really love editing, or maybe you like prefer writing, or maybe they feed different parts of you? How are they? What is each of them sort of like, and how do you feel about what each of them brings up for you?
Yeah. So I love both. I have to say it's certainly in some ways it's easier to to produce a solo authored books. I mean, I'm certainly still in dialogue with many people in the process of writing Until I'm Free. Every time I finish a chapter, I would send it to several people, and in fact, sent chapters to other Hamer scholars, folks who are experts too. So they were able to give me a very close read and point out all kinds of things that I might have missed. So there's still a process by which the book ended up being, I think, the product of a larger writing community of people reading and saying this is good, refine this or discard this. So all of that is still happening in the process of the solo authored book. But I think, so it is, but it's still easier though, because I think when it comes to, particularly for a project like 400 Souls, when you have so many voices, it's marvelous on the one hand, but it can also be frustrating too, because part of what you have to do as an editor is, to the best of your ability, ensure that the pieces collectively are cohesive, but you also don't want to take away from the originality and the voice of the writer. You want to give guidance to sharpen as much as possible, whether it's the analysis or just the prose or what have you, while still giving that person a sense of autonomy and as a writer, and I think, and you clearly trust them, but you also want to place your stamp of approval, so it's an interesting exchange. I would say what I'm certainly grateful when it came to 400 Souls. For the most part, I mean, people were absolutely, a pleasure to work with, in the sense that I don't recall having an author like straight up say, I'm not going to make those revisions, or I don't like your suggestion. People, and I've had I've had other projects where people have gone as far as to pull their pieces out, to say, listen, I don't want to make revisions, so I'm not going to be in the book.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is an unfortunate response.
Yeah.
Especially as, writers. I mean, I think it goes without saying that, iron sharpens iron, and if another writer is giving you feedback, you want to listen, because they often see things you don't see. And if they see it, that means other people see it. And so it was great though, for 400 Souls to have a group of people who, understood, the larger vision, and they did not give the kind of response. I think people were willing to refine. They were willing to make adjustments, and we trusted the writers, and the writers trusted us. And I think it just made for a beautiful collaboration. So I do enjoy both, which is partly why now I'm writing op-eds for MSNBC. But just last year I was editing for the Washington Post. I contemplated doing both at the same time. Could have, but realized no, this probably would not be a wise thing given all the constraints of my time. But I would have, done it because, on the one hand, I love writing my own work, but there's no greater feeling than working with an author, seeing a very rough draft that's not quite there, but just seeing the gems in there and getting them, helping them polish it and polish it and polish it, and then seeing it come out into the world in its just perfect form, and everyone, sharing it and enjoying it too. Like it's such a beautiful feeling, a rewarding feeling for me. And so I think I know I will be editing again in the future. I certainly have some plans to do so. Because it has just been a rewarding experience.
Do you, how do you, you have a young child, you are a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, you continue to get fellowships left and right. and you're also a columnist for MSNBC. And it's interesting. We've both been in academia. I graduated in May of 2020, but then decided to go into journalism as opposed to academia. And I'm curious how you think about the ways that your academic work is in conversation with your more public-facing work, your journalistic work, and if the part of the question that I always had was, to what extent is the public-facing work valued within an institution that can be very inward-looking, and I'm wondering if you feel, especially given the sort of social and political moment we find ourselves in, do you feel that shifting? Do you feel like, because it feels like there are more, in some ways there's never been more space or certainly more need for historians to write for a larger public, to help us make sense of the moment we find ourselves in. Do you feel like that's shifting, or do you think that so much of academia is still sort of siloed away from that sort of writing?
Unfortunately, what I find interesting about all of this is that there's sort of both the public response and the private response. So the public response from institutions we love this. This is wonderful. We love to see professors writing for all of these outlets. And of course, they will share the links, they will tweet about it. It's wonderful. It helps them. But privately, you would sit on a tenure committee, as I have multiple times, and or you'll sit around, listening to people talk about a scholar, assess, their work, and no surprise, people do not generally acknowledge, the op-ed. They don't necessarily acknowledge, public-facing projects the same way that they acknowledge, the traditional academic book published by a university press. And I encountered this very early in my career. I have to say, I took a lot of chances, quite frankly, and I knew I was taking chances. There was a moment in my life very early where I said, you know what, you are possibly going to find yourself without tenure and without an academic position. Can you live with that? And I said to myself, yes, I could live with that, and I'd be fine. And once I told myself that I would be fine, and I, as much as I appreciated the opportunity, and of course I went to school to get a PhD, I dreamt of being a professor. But once I came to the place where I accepted that it could all go away, and I would still be okay, I decided that my decisions would be guided not based on what I needed for tenure or what other people thought was the best decision for me, but more so that I would make decisions out of my own convictions. And so I participated. I was involved in projects where I had, department chairs say to me, this is just not going to count. And I said, I know, and I'm still doing it, and that was the calculation. At the same time, I still met the expectations. As I told people when I was working on, the Charleston syllabus, so many people said, this is so important for the community, but this is not going to count. And I understood that. But I also wrote a book, right? I also wrote a traditional book, that came out with a university press at the same time that I was working on another anthology, at the same time that I was writing op-eds, I was editing a blog. And so what I've learned to do is essentially, I think, always push myself to produce the kind of work that I would be proud of, certainly, but more to the point, work that I think would be most useful for my community, and I say my community broadly. I definitely want to make sure that I'm using my skills and my abilities in a way that strengthens and supports Black communities. And, I have to think along those lines because like Hamer, I grew up in a working poor family, and I did not imagine, really did not imagine that I would even be doing this. I credit mentors, I credit, professors who saw things in me that I did not see myself for encouraging me to pursue a PhD, and really standing by me through the whole process. And so now I think of the greater responsibility that I have, not solely to myself, but to my family, to my community, and that guides me. Even though I know it rubs against, a lot of what's happening in academic spaces. I'm grateful now to be, now I have tenure. It doesn't mean everything's perfect, but it means that I no longer slighted. When people make comments and talk about me, and oftentimes it'll come back to me and make critiques because they saw me giving commentary on TV, and they think that my time would be better used sitting down, writing a paper. I don't worry about those comments anymore. I just think the best place to be is to be doing the work that really you can stand by, and that you find fulfilling. Because as you know, academia can be so difficult. So many people are miserable in academia. So I just don't want to be that. I want to I want to be impactful, and to be impactful, I have to be writing the kinds of books that will make a difference in the lives of others. So quite frankly, the Hamer book, there will be academics who are going to, criticize the fact that I talk about the current moment, and maybe that will be the explanation they use to try to dismiss the book, and that's okay. I'm satisfied if people read the book and they say to me, "I learned something. This transformed me. This helped me figure out a strategy in my community." That is the most rewarding.
It's clear in the work that you do that this is coming from like a place of love for your community, for your people, like really wanting to give people the tools to understand. Looks like we have a question from the audience. Dr. Blaine, did you travel to Mississippi to conduct research? Was it easy to find primary sources?
No, so not in this particular context. And so what's interesting is I have traveled to Mississippi many times for research because, as it turns out, I have been thinking about Mississippi for a while. And my first book, Set the World on Fire, I actually talk about Mississippi in one of the chapters. So I had traveled so many times and collected a lot of material. But when I was writing the Hamer book, this was, I started writing around the fall of 2019. And then the pandemic hit. So all of my plans to actually travel, I had hoped that I would be going at least several times in that summer. It just didn't happen. What is good though several things worked out. One, because of the challenges of being able to actually move back and forth during the pandemic, it meant that I was able to connect with people fairly easily, because I think if you're trying to meet up with someone in person, to do an interview, and you might have to worry about coordinating many different things. The beauty of having the ability to say, okay, well, I'm available anytime. We can connect on Zoom. We can talk by phone, whatever works for you. And I think that was significant. So I was able to talk to many people and make good use of the virtual space in that sense. And the other thing that was remarkable, for which I'm most grateful, and I have to give a shout out to archivists and librarians who made this possible. So many, there was one instance where I needed to access one particular collection, and there are several collections on Hamer that are already easily accessible because they've been digitized. There was one instance where I needed to access a collection, and I was frustrated because it wasn't easily accessible online, and I was going through this process of how am I going to get my hands on this material. I reached out to someone who I knew, and they said, "Oh, I know someone who works there. Let me reach out." And to my surprise, within a few days, I received a huge file, and that person photocopied all kinds of material for me, and I just thought, wow, how amazing. I'm grateful because it gave me the access to material that would have otherwise not had access to because of the limitations of the pandemic. So going back to that community of how books, right, come to be. The community that supports you, it just makes all the difference.
we're coming up on our time, so for the last question, well, I want to do two. I just said that. Oh, so this is helpful. So before we answer this one, you've mentioned that the Hamer family got in touch with you. At what process in the book writing process did they get in touch with you, and what was that like? Did it put more? Did you feel more pressure? Did you feel relief? Did they read the book before it came out? Like, how did you navigate? I know people, when dealing with family, navigate that in all sorts of different ways. How did you navigate that?
Yes. So they reached out to me when I wrote the op-ed about Hamer in Time that I would later ultimately transform into the book. And so I was already in touch, but what I had to do, and this would not surprise anyone, I think, who understands kind of how we approach things as professional historians, I did not want to write a book and somehow be confined and restricted because, a relative might not have liked something I said or wanted me to say something another way. So so what I did was I had conversations, listened, took notes. In fact, I should say next week, I'm blanking on the date. It's I think it's either next week, Wednesday or Thursday. I'm actually doing an event with Hamer's daughter, and I mentioned earlier how she adopted several children in her lifetime. So I'm doing an event with Hamer's daughter. So I'm a little nervous, because I haven't heard her comments on the book. She's read the book, but what I did was I did not give a draft of the book until I essentially had submitted it. And I did that intentionally because I did not want to somehow be swayed. I was like, I could live with certain critiques. I could live with someone saying that maybe did not like the way I presented something, but I did not want to share material too early and then have feedback that would force me to change things, because in the end, all of my analysis was based on what I could verify in the archives, through historical newspapers. Even if I had oral histories, I had to back them up with other sources. And I just did the best work I could do as a historian. And to be clear, I wanted to make sure that they were aware of my project and got a sense of what I was trying to do, because I absolutely, as I mentioned earlier, I don't want to cause harm. I want to make sure that my work is impactful, in a positive way. But I just waited until it was done to share. So I've heard good things so far, and I'll have a more in-depth conversation next week, and certainly hope that they like the book. But as a writer, sometimes you just have to be open. But more to the point, you cannot. I mean, like I said, maybe other people can do this depending on their fields, but as a professional historian, it would go against my training to somehow involve the family too much at any step of the way. So that's just why I approached it that way.
That makes sense. Before we head out, what are 3 books that you would recommend to the audience?
Oh, okay. So I just turned because I actually have some books that I'm reading, like actually behind me. So I'll show this one, which I really, this is a book called The History of Black Studies that just came out from Pluto Press. Abdul Akalimat is the author, and I really love this book because it just, the author happens to be one of the pioneers of Black studies, and so it's wonderful to really reflect on the history, both through his personal experience and his observations, and just a larger research. It's well researched. So that's one book that I recommend. And of course, so that I'm not bluffing. I have your book, Clint, How the Word is Passed. So if anyone's watching, if you have not read Clint's book, you have to. And then, and this one too, Franchise by Marsha Chatelain. Yeah. So I have so many other books.
Which recently won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes. Won the Pulitzer in history. So I recommend all of those books. I love reading, as you can imagine, and I'm generally reading many books at once. But I think that's the best way to approach it, because otherwise, it's like I feel like I have to wait till I finish one good book for another good book, but then I could just have like 10 good books being read at once, which is exciting. So,
well, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for the conversation. I don't know if they're coming to pull us out, but
thank you.
And again, if you have not bought this book, buy it now. Do it. Do it from an indie bookstore. Do it from Busboys on Bookshop. Do it. It's excellent. Thank you so much, Keisha.
Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute.
That's great. I love StreamYard because it even tells you your mic is muted. So helpful. Funny of you to bring up Libro FM, because I also love audiobooks, and both of your books are amazing on audio. So thank you both so much for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate it. Any last words? Any last thoughts? I think it's time to go put the little ones to bed or something.
Yes.
All right. Thank you all so much. Good night. And all right. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Like Clint said, you can definitely purchase Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's enduring message to America through Busboys and Poets Books, either through our Eventbrite, which will be live until 11 p.m. tonight. So you can go ahead and purchase that. That comes with direct shipping from our store to your home. Or you could purchase it online at bookshop.org under Busboys and Poets Books. In case you have any questions, you can always email bookevents@busboysandpoets.com. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us. And look out tomorrow evening, where we will be welcoming Ellie Fishman for her book, Refugee High. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening. And like always, peace and love.